Hey, Mr. Howard here with chapter 18 of the Picture of Dorian Gray for you. Last time we read chapter 17, in which Dorian had gone to Selby Royale with the Duchess and Lord Henry and some of his friends. It was mostly sort of like a series of witty conversations between Lord Henry and the Duchess, who Dorian's having an affair with, Duchess of Monmouth. There was some social commentary in there against the upper class, which is, I think one of the main facets of the book that Oscar Wilde is trying to get across. But the chapter ends with a really important moment where Dorian is in the conservatory. Sounds like Clue, right? It's an indoor greenhouse, trying to get an orchid for the Duchess to wear that night. When he looks out the window and he sees James Vane's face, he faints and then he goes upstairs. So James Vane, theoretically, is here at Selby Royale looking to get revenge on Dorian for the death of Sybil. So finally, some of Dorian's actions are going to have real consequences. I mean, he has dodged consequences for his actions his entire life because of his innocent appearance, because of his ability to seem young and perfect. All right, my dog is licking over here. Hold on. B, quit it. Nobody wants to listen to you licking on the video. It's just not. Sorry. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to start reading. The next day, he did not leave the house, and indeed spent most of the time in his own room, sick with a wild terror of dying, and yet indifferent to life itself. That's sort of an ironic paradox, sick with a wild terror of dying, and yet indifferent to life itself. Also, it very much feels like depression, and hold on, let's be honest, quarantine. Let's read that line again. I think anybody who's quarantining in their house, over a month in may feel this. The next day he did not leave the house and indeed spent most of the time in his own room, sick with a wild terror of dying, and yet indifferent to life itself. It's almost like an ironic prophecy. Whatever. The consciousness of being hunted, snared, tracked down had begun to dominate him. If the tapestry did but tremble in the wind, he shook. The dead leaves that were blown against the leaded panes seemed to him like his own wasted resolutions and wild regrets. I like those two lines, or words. Phrases. Wasted resolutions and wild regrets. Let's go back to Lord Henry. He's talked about both of those things. He says resolutions are checks men draw on an account in which they have no money. And he said that regrets were a luxury for somebody who's done something bad rather than, something to feel bad about. The luxury of regret, I think, was Lord Henry's phrase. So Dorian seems to be turning around on those, having an attack of conscience, if you will. When he closed his eyes, but is it only because he's being hunted now? Is it only because there is a divine retribution in the form of James Vane who's coming for him? He seems to be able to ignore consequence and conscience and any kind of morality unless there's an imminent threat to his life. And then all of a sudden he's like, oh my God, so is this like the threat of hell? Something to think about. But perhaps it had been only his fancy that had called vengeance out of the night and set the hideous shapes of punishment before him. Actual life was chaos, but there was something terribly logical in the imagination. It was the imagination that set remorse to dog the feet of sin. It was the imagination that made each crime bear its misshapen brood. In the common world of fact, the wicked were not punished nor the good rewarded. More social commentary. In the common world of fact, everything's chaos. There is no karma. Bad people don't get what's coming to them. They get rewarded for their evil actions. The rich, can do whatever they want, and they end up reaping benefits from it. Again, morality is a form of fiction, Dorian is saying here. Success was given to the strong, failure thrust upon the weak. That was all. Besides, had any stranger been prowling around the house, he would have been seen by the servants or the keepers. Had any footmarks been found on the flower beds, the gardeners would have reported it. Yes, it had been merely fancy. Sybil Vane's brother had not come back to kill him. He had sailed away in his ship to founder in some winter sea. From him, at any rate, he was safe. Why, the man did not know who he was, could not know who he was. The mask of youth had saved him. And yet, if it had been merely an illusion, how terrible it was to think that conscience could raise such fearful phantoms and give them visible form and make them move before one. So from Dorian's perspective, he's sort of damned both ways. Like maybe James Vane wasn't there at all. Maybe he imagined it. But if he imagined it, his conscience is taking over and making him see phantoms and think they're real. He's going crazy. So either way is a negative outcome, whether James is there or James is not there. What sort of life would be his if day and night shadows of his crime were to peer at him from silent corners and mock him from secret places, to whisper in his ear as he sat at the feast? That's an allusion to Macbeth, anybody who's familiar with that play. To wake him with icy fingers as he lay asleep. As the thought crept through his brain, he grew pale with terror, and the air seemed to him to have become suddenly colder. Oh, in what a wild hour of madness had he killed his friend. How ghastly the mere memory of the scene. He saw it all again. Each hideous detail came back to him with added horror. Out of the black cave of time, terrible and swathed in scarlet, rose the image of his sin. When Lord Henry came at 6 o'clock, he found him crying as one whose heart would break. It was not till the third day that he ventured to go out. There was something in the clear, pine-scented air of that winter morning that seemed to bring him back his joyousness and his ardor for life. But it was not merely the physical conditions of the environment that had caused the change. His own nature had revolted against the excess of anguish that had sought to maim and mar the perfection of its calm. With subtle and finely wrought temperaments, it is always so. Their strong passions must either bruise or bend. They either slay the man or themselves die. Shallow sorrows and shallow loves live on. The lovers and sorrows that are great are destroyed by their own plenitude. Besides, he had convinced himself that he had been the victim of a terror-stricken imagination, and looked back now on his fears with something of pity and not a little of contempt. All right, pause. So, he can't stay locked up in his room forever. 3 days, again, that biblical number we were talking about earlier. He goes on out. But I like this line that strong passions must either bruise or bend. They either slay the man or themselves die. Shallow sorrows and shallow loves that live on. That's an interesting phrase. Of course, it reeks of Lord Henry and clearly the influence of Lord Henry on Dorian. But this idea that stop licking. Nobody wants to listen to it. This idea that that if you have a shallow love, it can last a lifetime. But if you have a strong, passionate love, it's going to burn itself out. And maybe there's some truth to that. Like, if you're ever in a relationship with somebody who is really into big, passionate gestures, how many of those can you make? I think maybe there's something to this. Anyway, after breakfast, he walked with the Duchess for an hour in the garden, and then drove across the park to join the shooting party. A shooting party is a very Victorian thing, especially rich people. They would go out and they would shoot like pheasants. There'd be these servants called beaters, and they'd walk along with sticks and like smack the bushes and make a lot of noise and scare the birds, and the birds would fly into the sky. And then all these rich people standing with shotguns, usually fancy double-barreled shotguns, would shoot them as they flew overhead. And they just walk and talk in a line. I think there's a scene in Wedding Crashers that's very much like that. But that's a shooting party. It would have been well known to a Victorian reader. The crisp frost lay like salt upon the grass. The sky was an inverted cup of blue metal. A thin film of ice bordered the flat, reed-grown lake. At the corner of the pine wood, he caught sight of Sir Geoffrey Colston, the Duchess's brother, jerking 2 spent cartridges out of his gun. He jumped from the cart, and having told the groom to take the mare home, made his way towards his guest through the withered bracken and rough undergrowth. "Have you had good sport, Geoffrey?" he asked. "Not very good, Dorian. I think most of the birds have gone to the open. I dare say we'll be better after lunch when we get to new ground." Dorian strolled along by his side. The keen, aromatic air, the brown and red lights that glimmered in the wood, the hoarse cries of the beaters ringing out from time to time, and the sharp snaps of the guns that followed, fascinated him with a sense of delightful freedom. He was dominated by the carelessness of happiness, by a high indifference of joy. Suddenly, from the lumpy tussock of old grass some 20 yards in front of them, with black-tipped ears erect and long hinder limbs throwing it forward, started a hare. It bolted for a thicket of alders. Sir Geoffrey put his gun to his shoulder, but there was something in the animal's graceful movement that strangely charmed Dorian Gray, and he cried out at once, "Don't shoot it, Geoffrey! Let it live!" "What nonsense, Dorian," laughed his companion, and as the hare bounded into the thicket, he fired. There were 2 cries heard. One, the cry of a hare in pain, which is dreadful. The second, the cry of a man in agony, which is worse. "Good heavens, I've hit a beater!" exclaimed Sir Geoffrey. "What an ass the man was to get in front of the guns! Stop shooting there!" he called out at the top of his voice. "A man is hurt!" The head keeper came running up with a stick in his hand. "Where, sir? Where is he?" he shouted. At the same time, the firing ceased all along the line. "Here!" answered Sir Geoffrey angrily, hurrying toward the thicket. "Why on earth don't you keep your men back? Spoiled my shooting for the day." More social commentary. Geoffrey's not concerned that he hurt or killed a man. He's like, "Oh, it ruined my shooting for the day. It's your fault that you didn't, keep this man back. Not my fault for shooting him." So you can sort of see this indifference of the rich. They're concerned with their own pleasures and their own enjoyments, regardless of whether somebody else gets hurt. If somebody else gets hurt along the way, it's their fault. We can take this and we can look at it sort of allegorically if we wanted to. Dorian watched them as they plunged into the alder clump, brushing the lithe swinging branches aside. In a few moments they emerged, dragging a body after them into the sunlight. He turned away in horror. It seemed to him that misfortune followed wherever he went. He heard Sir Geoffrey ask whether the man was really dead, and the affirmative answer of the keeper. The woods seemed to him to have become suddenly alive with faces. There was the trampling of myriad feet and the low buzz of voices. A great copper-breasted pheasant came beating through the boughs overhead. After a few moments that were to him, in his perturbed state, like endless hours of pain, he felt a hand laid on his shoulder. He started and looked round. I like that line. It says, it seemed to him that misfortune followed wherever he went. That's what Basil said to him about his acquaintances and friends when he met him that night before he died. So it's an echo of that line from earlier. After a few moments that were to him in his perturbed state like endless hours of pain. How many times have we heard that idea? Whenever Dorian feels anything, it's like, endless hours of pain as soon as he experiences a negative emotion. It's interesting. Why is that? He can't feel anything bad, and as soon as he does, it's somehow exaggerated to him? Or is he just a whiner? I don't like Dorian. I don't know if you've noticed. "Dorian," said Lord Henry, "I'd better tell them that the shooting is stopped for today. It would not look well to go on." Again, Guy's dead, and Lord Henry's concerned with what it looks like for Dorian if he continues. "I wish it were stopped forever, Harry," he answered bitterly. "The whole thing is hideous and cruel. Is the man—" He could not finish the sentence. "I'm afraid so," rejoined Lord Henry. "He got the whole charge of shot in his chest. He must have died almost instantaneously. Come, let us go home." They walked side by side in the direction of the avenue for nearly 50 yards without speaking. Then Dorian looked at Lord Henry and said with a heavy sigh, "It is a bad omen, Harry, a very bad omen." "What is?" asked Lord Henry. "What is?" He's already forgotten. "Oh, the accident, I suppose. My dear fellow, it can't be helped. It was the man's own fault. Why did he get in front of the guns? Besides, it is nothing to us. It is rather awkward for Geoffrey, of course. It does not do to pepper beaters. It makes people think one is a wild shot, and Geoffrey is not. He shoots very straight. But there is no use talking about the matter. It's nothing to us," says Lord Henry. The social commentary continues. Dorian shook his head. "It's a bad omen, Harry. I fear as if something horrible were going to happen to some of us. To myself, perhaps," he added, passing a hand over his eyes with a gesture of pain. The elder man laughed. "The only horrible thing in the world is ennui, Dorian. Ennui's boredom. So according to Lord Henry, the only bad thing in the world is being bored." That is the one sin for which there is no forgiveness. But we are not likely to suffer from it unless these fellows keep chatting about the thing at dinner. I must tell them the subject is to be tabooed. The only thing that would make me bored is listening to anything about this dead guy. As for Omen,